Hi, welcome to Lethal Lamb Reads. I'm Penny, and as usual, I'm here to talk about some bookish things. Specifically, I wanted to do some mini reviews of the last 4 books that I read. So the first book that I've got to talk about is the only audiobook that I'm talking about today, and that is A Court of Mist and Fury by Sarah J. Maas. So this is the second book in the A Court of Thorns and Roses series. A Court of Thorns and Roses was a Beauty and the Beast retelling, and I have heard that this story is supposed to be like a Hades and Persephone retelling, but I guess maybe. It was set up in the first book that our main character, Feyre, was going to have to spend a week every month with this other court of Fae. And that's a little bit like the setup in Hades and Persephone, where Persephone would spend half the year with Hades and half the year with her mother. So I can see the parallels, but I guess it's not as fleshed out a story as Beauty and the Beast is. So beyond that setup, there's not really that much alignment. And I went into the story with really low expectations. Basically, I don't really like romance or war, and this story is all about a romance, and there's this impending war, which supposedly they're preparing for. But that was one of my main complaints about the story. It felt like they were doing all these things, but every single plot point seemed to be just to build the romance rather than actually having any real purpose. There's this impending war, and they're saying at times that they're very stressed about that, but at the same time they just seem to be fucking around a lot of the time. And when I say fucking, I do mean fucking. There are quite a few sex scenes in the story, although they weren't as cringy as I was thinking they might be. And I did think that the relationship in this story was a lot more believable than the relationship in the first book. I can also see why people, especially younger readers, might really like the friend group that's developed and the dynamics within that group. So I guess overall, it wasn't the book for me, but that was expected. And I can see why other people might like it. But I really would recommend people only go into it if they're into the romance element, because the fantasy element is very weak. So the second book that I read is one that I was reading for my owls as part of the Magical Readathon. I will leave all the links to that readathon down below if you are interested in it. But the readathon basically has 12 different prompts, each of which are a different Hogwarts class, and you need to get certain classes in order to achieve a certain magical career. I had decided that I wanted to be an alchemist, which is somewhat crazy because it involves doing all 12 classes, and so far these 4 books are the only ones I've read for it, so I'm quite far behind because it's already the 23rd of April. But putting that aside, I read The Bear and the Nightingale by Katherine Arden. I always say Arden because of New Zealand's Prime Minister Jacinta Ardern, but it's not that. It's Katherine Arden. I got it right. So Katherine Arden wrote this story. It is like a Russian folklore retelling. So I'm reading it for Ancient Runes, which requires you to read a retelling. So the myth that's being retold involves a young girl who ends up marrying the Frost King or something like that. And in this story, it's a girl named Vassia, and my camera is gonna die. Be right back. So Vassia lives in this forest in the north of Russia where everything is cold and snowy, and she's able to see all these Russian folklore creatures, and she builds relationships with them through kindness and strength, and she's a really wonderful character. I really enjoyed all the parts of the story that were about Vassia. One thing I will say is the Russian names are a little bit difficult for me, but that's my problem. But just in general, Russians tend to have like different versions of the names, and sometimes that gets a little bit confusing, and also some of the names are quite similar, so it is something you need to get used to. Overall, it wasn't too bad, but it did confuse me a few times. Also, what I was about to say is that there are large parts of the story which are not about Vassia. They're about different political shit going on, the royalty, the priesthood, all that kind of nonsense, and I found those bits a little bit boring. I just wanted to get in with the magical creatures. I'm always there for the magic, right? So those bits did frustrate me a little bit, although I will say that I really enjoyed seeing the priest get his comeuppance and all the stuff that happened to him. And I have put a request in at the library for the next book in the series because Vassia is off on her journey and I'm really interested to see what happens next. So then the next book I read while I was away on holiday, and that is Room by Emma Donoghue. So the story is told from the perspective of a 5-year-old who was born inside this room and has never left it. So obviously his mother has been abducted at some point and then had him, and they've never been allowed to leave. So some parts of this book were quite disturbing, especially when told from a 5-year-old's perspective, but given the subject matter, I think that was expected, and it would have been less genuine if it hadn't been disturbing. I think for me, I always find it really interesting to read about people in these extreme situations, even though it's horrible. But I think looking at the worst things that humans do can help us to figure out how to avoid it, also help us to understand the victims and work out how we might help them better as well. It's often around these awful situations that people's strength and ability to adapt really comes out, and I think that's always really inspiring and motivating, even though it's an awful situation. So that said, I'm not sure really how genuine or accurate this was. I think it was really interesting hearing it from the 5-year-old's perspective, and it definitely would have been a completely different story if it had been told from the mother's perspective. In some ways, it kind of reminds me of when I was young. My parents got divorced when I was really young, and whenever people would find out, they would say, "Oh, I'm so sorry." But for me, I didn't really remember my parents being together, so I didn't feel like I'd lost anything, and I never understood why people would be worried about that. And it's the same with this 5-year-old. He's always lived in the room, so he doesn't see anything wrong with living in the room. In fact, that's the place he's most comfortable. But another downside to this book was that it is basically told in 5 really long chapters, so 5 parts, and each part is just one chapter of this 5-year-old talking and talking and talking, all these crazy thoughts and crazy things happening. And it did make it a little bit hard to get through at some points because it just felt like you had to get through quite a lot to get to the next significant event. And some of the parts of the books that quite a lot of time was spent on didn't necessarily feel that useful. But I did think it got more and more interesting as we went on and big things started happening. So if this is a topic that interests you, I would probably recommend it. I do need to watch the movie to see how the movie compares. So I believe I read this one for Defense Against the Dark Arts, which was to read a book starting with R. I didn't have many on my shelves, so this is the only one we really had to work with. And I did it, so that's good. Then the next book I read was nothing too serious, and that is Ellie's World #2, Dates, Double Dates, and Big Big Trouble. So I read this for Potions. We needed to read a sequel. I haven't read any of the other books in this series, but it is #2, so it does count as a sequel, I think. Basically, this story is about a family where the mother is very young and she's basically run out on them, has gone off to travel the world, and the father is now raising these 3 girls who are all teenagers and a younger son. And the big drama that happens in this book is that the kids think that the father has started to date someone and he is keeping it secret from them. I would say that I think this is probably a good book to read if you're in your very early teens, maybe a little bit younger. It was quite a young book, but there were some good lessons in it, and I think it was probably quite realistic. I know that when I was that age, everything was about boys, and for Ellie, everything is about boys. Actually, just a little while ago, I found these diary type letters that I'd written to myself, and it was just boys, 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 boys. Awful. But I guess that's what happens. So, very boy focused. Obviously, these books are a little bit older. Let's see, when are they published? 2001. That's not that long ago, but there isn't really any LGBT kind of stuff. I think it's a bit early for that kind of thing to be very prevalent in literature for younger people. But I did think it had some good messages. It wasn't awful to read. I thought it might be, but it wasn't. I will say that the kids in these books always seem to be a lot more like mobile and able to go out on their own than I was ever allowed to as a kid. And I don't know, is that what everyone else's lives were like? So it was not what my life was like. Anyway, those were the last 4 books that I read. I do want to read another 8 books this month, so I need to get to work on that. We'll see what we can do. But if you have read any of the books that I talked about today, I would love to hear your thoughts about them. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you're having a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time.